Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Professor Leon Blevins, El Paso Community College Television. Recently, I had an interview with our state senator, Jose Rodriguez, longtime Democrat here in El Paso. For a long time, he was our county attorney. He now is serving us in the Texas legislature. At the end of the interview recently, and it just ran on air just this past weekend, here we are in early November, and he closed out the interview by saying, I'd like to come back and talk about democracy. So my co-producer, Marco Lara, and I said, okay, we'll have you back, and we put it on the calendar for today's date for him to come back and talk about democracy. I want to start this interview with two historical things. In the same year, 2010, a journalist with El Dario, who's now with the El Paso Times, she called me and asked me, what's the significance of this election year in 2010? Lorena Figueroa is her name. And I said, Leona, the big issue, I think, is this is a census year. And after every census year, the state legislatures draw legislative district maps for elections for a 10-year period. They tend to draw them to their favor of the majority in the legislature. Republicans draw to protect Republicans' districts. Democrats draw to protect Democrats' districts. That's a big one. As it turned out, the Republicans swept a lot of elections in 2010. The other thing, the Supreme Court that year decided, and this happened after I had the conversation with Leona, the U.S. Supreme Court decided something called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. For over 100 years, the Supreme Court had held that corporations are artificial people. But in 2010, 5-4 vote, majority Republicans, they decided corporations are human beings with rights of free speech and political spending, just like an ordinary human being. Those two events in 2010 changed everything and affected democracy. Jose Rodriguez, welcome back.
I'm glad to be here. That's a very nice introduction to the topic, Professor.
Now, you were elected to state senate in 2010.
I was,
and you got down there and got in the big fight immediately.
Immediately because of, several things. One was redistricting, because we went through the redistricting process, found myself standing on the Senate floor and indicating that the maps that had been adopted were going to be declared unconstitutional because they were so skewed towards the Republican Party, because as you point out, the party in power usually tries to preserve itself in power. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it was so blatant that more recently, just a month or so ago, the federal courts finally got around, after all this time, to declaring those redistricting maps intentionally discriminatory. So you're correct. I think those were monumental changes that took place in 2010. But let's not forget that these take place every 10 years.
Right.
We're coming up again on this process in 2020. And the Supreme Court U.S. Supreme Court recently heard a case out of Wisconsin that may provide some future guidance on how we do redistricting in this country. But there's no question that gerrymandering, as it's commonly called, drawing the lines in salamander-like type of designs, are detrimental to the democratic process, because we're supposed to be, under the Constitution, a system where each person's vote counts as much as any other person's vote. One man, one vote, we used to call it. I say one person, one person vote. But now it's come to the point where, because of gerrymandering, you are now essentially diluting the power of that person's vote, because to the extent that it doesn't make a difference when the majority has drawn maps that are going to keep them in power, you're not going to be electing a candidate of your choice. Similarly, as a result of the Supreme Court's Citizens United case, now we have corporations exercising a tremendous outsized power, if you will, over the results of elections, whereby millions and millions of dollars are poured in to campaigns by corporations to determine the outcomes. And so our democracy has never been, in my view, in as precarious a position as it is now in the 21st century. And we've had, as you know, you're a professor of history and
Yeah, we
government,
always have
so
that.
you know we've always had this from the times of Washington and Jefferson and Adams, and from then on we've had issues with our democracy. It's been a process that many people consider to be the greatest experiment on earth.
Okay, now we have such a short amount of time. What do you think are some of the other issues that are threatening to democracy? I believe democracy has to do with meaningful periodic competitive races.
Yes.
Okay, what are some things that have been going on with regard to free speech, with regard to appointments to political offices, public offices, and so on? What do you think are some of the other areas that are threatening to democracy at our time, 2017?
Well, I think if you talk about free speech, we've had a lot of incidents here lately about speakers that have been barred from speaking in our university campuses, including in Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, which is, of course, the recognized as the free speech movement back in the early 60s. And I think there's a question there as to how far we go in deciding whether certain people, because we do not like their views or what they stand for, are allowed to speak in the public square. There's no question there's an issue there that we need to be concerned about. You know, appointments, I was just reading in the paper about Donald Trump, President Trump's appointments for ambassadorships and for the cabinets. I'm talking about the cabinet representatives that are the heads of the various federal departments, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, and so forth. And you've always had controversial appointments, but I don't think we have ever had, to this extent, appointments of individuals whose mission in life was to get rid of those very agencies that were appointed to represent and to advocate for,
or at least weaken
and to
them,
administer,
or weaken them.
Well, our own Governor Perry comes to mind, right? I mean, he famously said he wanted to get rid of the Department of Energy, and now he's heading the Department of Energy. The woman who runs the Department of Education doesn't believe in public education. She believes in vouchers and subsidies for private schools and charter schools and such, and on down the line. More recently, a controversial appointment that had to be withdrawn, the man himself got out of it, was an individual that was exposed in 60 Minutes, the CBS program, as being totally the opposite of the office he was going to represent and run, the Department of Agriculture's science section. And this guy turns out to be not even a scientist.
Right.
Okay?
Well, you know, the opposite of democracy is autocracy, authoritarianism,
Yes.
centralization in one person surrounding himself with family members or political hacks to achieve personal objectives. Not serving the public, but serving self. That's anti-democratic. How do you view this? This is the age of Trump. Now, he's our president, so we have a right to talk about our president and the policies he's putting in place that deal with democracy. What about that?
Well, the good thing about our democracy is that regardless, we can always express ourselves and we can always fight for strengthening our democracy when we see it threatened. So when you have a President Trump that not only disregards tradition in the form of appointments that he's been making, but also disregards and disrespects our balance of powers enumerated in the U.S. Constitution, where if it's the judiciary and you have these federal judges that rule against him, whether it's on the Muslim ban or anything else, he criticizes them. He makes it personal. Whether it's the legislative branch, where he criticizes people like John McCain, a war hero, and saying that in his mind he's not a hero, and others who don't go along with his program, where he criticizes even his own executive branch, as we know, whether it's Secretary of State Tillerson, whether it's Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General. It doesn't matter. The man, I'm talking about the president, has no sense of what the balance of powers are all about, enumerated in the Constitution. And I think that's a big threat to our democracy. Here at the state level, I work in the Texas Senate. I'm a state senator. I have a lieutenant governor who has started to disregard, do away with long-standing Senate rules that help promote more democracy, more participation, more consensus building, compromise, and has destroyed that in these last 2 sessions to the point where now the majority, meaning the Republicans, 20 of them versus 11 Democrats, run by the lieutenant governor, can determine the outcome of any piece of legislation in the Senate without any meaningful debate, without any meaningful input from Democrats, without any consensus building whatsoever. Because he did away with what's called the 2/3 rule that originally required at least 21 out of the 31-member Senate to agree to bring a bill up for debate on the Senate floor. That means you had to get 21 votes. There were only 20 Republicans, or 19 back then. So you had to have at least 2 Democrats supportive of your legislation to bring it up. Now, since he's done away with the rule, and you have a 3/5 rule, all it requires is 19 votes. Well, there's 20 Republicans. So clearly, the Republicans can bring up anything they want without a single Democratic vote. And that, in my view, is very harmful to the democratic process in the Senate. This last election, I had a big fight with the lieutenant governor over another rule that he didn't abolish, but he suspended it in order to promote his agenda, which was called the gag rule, which is it's a rule that basically requires that if an individual senator raises that rule, you got to get at least 48 hours notice before there is a discussion of a particular bill. We had so many bills during the regular special session, 20 of them, most of them controversial, that were being proposed past midnight without any opportunity to have more review of those bills, some of them over 100 pages long, with a hearing scheduled for the very next morning. Well, that very morning, because this was past midnight. So starting at 8 o'clock that morning. And I asked for at least honoring that rule, 48 hours notice, not only for me to be able to be more prepared and to study the legislation better, but also for the witnesses who travel from distant parts of the state that may have an interest in weighing in on a particular piece of legislation. They suspended the rule so that it didn't apply. And consequently, we were forced to consider bills that were full of errors in their language. Even the authors of the bill didn't realize that some provisions in their bill were problematical just because of the hurried rush to have these bills heard and passed out of the Senate.
And they could become law.
Some of them did become law. Some of them did become law. And so I think that we have reached a stage in the Texas legislature where we are very closely approximating the divide in Washington, where, as you know, Republicans and Democrats generally don't work together. During President Obama's 8th year in office, he was opposed consistently with the number one goal, as the majority leader of the Senate, McConnell, said, to kick him out of office. That was their main goal. And so what does this mean for our democracy? What does it mean for people who expect our elected officials, leaders, whether they're in Austin or whether they're in Washington, to work together to solve problems, to compromise, to reach consensus, and be working on legislation on a bipartisan basis? It means that we have basically come to the point where unless citizens wake up and do something about it in elections, then we will continue this trend and be a divided country as we have never been before, and as we have seen since the year 2000, when we had remember the Chads in Florida, and how that election was determined by the U.S. Supreme Court and not by the voters. And so I think that something can be done about it. What can be done? I think people who are concerned and who value democracy and take pride in how the United States is different than other countries in that respect, that they take a more active role in their electoral process, in their operations of government, local, state, and federal, by participating in city council meetings, county commissioners meetings, in the state legislature, at the federal level. If we don't, then the democracy as we have known it is not going to exist anymore in this country.
What's been most surprising, I think, about the way Trump has done some of this, and in the past I've had friends in the U.S. Congress, okay? And I would go there and visit with them. And I'd watch them go through the regular order of hearings and subcommittee hearings and all of that, and then getting together and voting and making a decision and compromising on a lot of these things. And they could compete over the policies, but they still tended to be friends.
Yes, of course.
But in many cases lately, Donald Trump, with regard to health care and tax policy and things, he has only Republicans come to the White House for a dinner with him and see what they can do, and then drop things on the Democrats. And that's happened more than once in recent days. Has our Governor Abbott, has he done anything similar, meeting only with Republicans and then leaving you Democrats out and then saying, here's what we want you to do?
No, he does meet with, last session he invited all 11 Democrats to go have separately in groups of Republicans, groups of 8 or so, go and have lunch with him over at the mansion. This session he did it, but to a lesser extent, and some of us were not invited. So I think it's again an indicator of the way things are headed, right? And by the way, I need to make a correction on myself.
Okay.
It must have been a Freudian slip on my mind, because I said the gag rule, but it's actually called the tag rule.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess I was thinking in a Freudian way, we were being gagged, right?
Yeah, you said
So I
a
called
tag
the
on
gag
it, so
rule.
it gives you
It's a tag
48
rule.
hours to look at
Yes,
the bill.
yes.
Okay.
You tag a piece of legislation, so you have 48 hours. But getting back to your point, that is, unfortunately, not only with regard to these dinners that Trump is having and so forth, it also is the case with major pieces of legislation where it's only the Republicans that are behind closed doors trying to fashion the details, whether it be repeal and replace of Obamacare, of the Affordable Care Act, whether it be the tax reform, so-called tax reform bill that is coming up. I mean, these measures are monumental pieces of legislation that will impact people's lives for years to come, and yet we're having only basically one party involved in fashioning the language for those policy matters. And even though Obama got criticized for the way Obamacare was legislated, nobody can accuse him of not having invited and had taken a whole year to finally bring it up for a vote, as opposed to the way the Republicans under Trump have been doing the repeal of Obamacare and the way they've been doing the tax reform bill, the tax bill. I mean, this is a very seriously dangerous trend in developing legislation. I mean, what more of an indicator do we need when we elect people to come to these legislative bodies, whether it be the federal or the state level, and pass legislation that will come up, that proposes solutions to address problems in the country, whether it's access to health care, quality education, job creation opportunities, and so forth. You want to solve some of these problems that we have. But instead, if you have only one party monopolizing the drafting of the language and discussing and debating the proposal before it's unveiled behind closed doors, then what do we have in terms of our democracy? So all of these things, it seems to me, that we have been talking about, redistricting, gerrymandering, appointments, doing away with rules that promote compromise and discussion, doing things behind closed doors. All of these are serious erosions of our democratic principles on which this country was founded.
Let's touch a very controversial one in the last few minutes that we have. Guns.
Yes.
Texas is a gun state, has always been a gun state.
Yes.
And just yesterday, a church in Texas was shot up by a man with a semi-automatic rifle and became, I think I heard on the news, the largest mass murder in Texas history.
Yes.
How do we deal with something like that is so controversial? Can we not touch it at all? Some are saying we can't discuss that now. When are we ever going to discuss guns?
Well,
if we can't discuss
Professor,
it?
I think it's nonsense to say we can't discuss it now. If there's a time for us to discuss it, it should be now, immediately, on the heels of these latest mass murders that take place in our country. Yes, this is the biggest one in Texas, yet Texas is one of those states that prides itself on its gun culture, and in the last session, we allowed guns on campus. In the session before, we also allowed more opening of concealed carry legislation. And every session, we see some new gun bills that get introduced. The governor, as a result of this latest shooting, said, well, we should just pray. And the attorney general said people should be allowed to have their guns to protect themselves in churches. None of these proposals make us more safe.
Well, the Attorney General said that every person in that church should have had a gun.
Well,
Think about
I
it.
know.
Half the people that were killed were young kids.
I understand that. And it's just sheer nonsense. The fact is that we should be working for common sense solutions to gun violence in this country. And there are many proposals. We've talked about background checks. We've talked about banning, the assault rifles. We've talked about the latest one as a result of the Las Vegas shooting was to do away with that stock, they call it, that modifies the gun to become an automatic weapon. And now I'm reading that because of that shooting has died down some, people are no longer talking about doing something about it. So the bottom line is we as a society have a responsibility to protect one another with common sense, community safety solutions to the proliferation of guns in this country and this state in particular. And unless we do that, then I think we're going to continue seeing more of these. People say, well, people that are criminal, they're still going to get a hold of guns. They're going to do whatever it takes. You can point to many other countries where they don't have a gun culture the way we do, and they don't have the level of violence that Stokely Carmichael back in the 60s, you remember, said that violence is American as apple pie?
Right. Power comes out of the barrel of a gun.
Power comes out of the barrel of the gun. You and I, since we're from that era, we're going to keep saying some of those things, right? But the truth is that there are common sense solutions. There's a lot of guns used. I was county attorney, and one of the things I did was protective orders against domestic violence and family violence. And believe you me, many of those were victims subsequently of people who used guns on their loved ones. I introduced a bill this last session that we called it the Lethal Violence Prevention Bill. That is, that if somebody has a history of domestic violence, that that either law enforcement or a loved one can obtain a court order that prohibits them from purchasing weapons or having weapons. Okay? Now, the naysayers will say, well, that's not going to stop it because if they're hell-bent on killing somebody, they're going to get a weapon. Well, maybe so, but I submit to you and to our viewing audience that we can curtail the level of violence committed by domestic violence abusers if we had that kind of legislation in place. I didn't even get a hearing in the bill in the Texas Senate.
No hearing.
No hearing. That's what we've come to in this state. So I'm glad you bring this up because it is a very troubling issue that we've had for years and years. Everybody recognizes that the power of the National Rifle Association is the #1 contributing reason why Congress doesn't do anything about gun violence in this country because everybody's fearful of the NRA.
Well, that's one of the threats to democracy, is so much power in one specific industry or business. Concentration of power, whether it's in business, whether it's in guns, or anything else, that can also be a threat to democracy.
Absolutely. How is it that the National Institute of Health cannot even do research on whether gun violence as a public health threat
Right.
contributes to the public's health and well-being? I mean, you can't even develop data on some of these factors because the gun lobby, the NRA, passed legislation. I say they passed it because they got their surrogates to pass it, their bill that prohibits any funding of the National Health Institute to conduct this type of research.
Okay, let's end on a positive note. We have about 3 minutes. What can we do to make democracy work better?
Well, I think we can encourage people, as I said earlier, to participate more in the democratic process. One, by registering to vote if you're eligible. Two, by going out to vote. Three, by taking it a step further, participating in the democratic process at all levels, in the city council meetings, county commissioners meetings, water district board meetings, school board meetings, the Texas legislature. There's no excuse. If you can go from El Paso to Austin, I know it's a distance, you can do it now electronically through the internet. You can do the same thing at the federal level. The downside that if we don't do this is the kinds of things that we've been talking about that have been eroding our democracy. And so people are so turned off by politics, by corruption, by people who don't do anything, people who don't compromise, the kinds of things that we've been talking about. But I tell people, what is the alternative? If you just throw up your hands in the air, Professor, and say everybody is corrupt, the Congress has got the lowest ratings ever from the public in terms of its support, we've got to reverse these trends. And so one of the things I've done in my office is through a youth advisory committee, develop this student voter initiative where the young people, high school students, community college students, and UTEP students have gone to our area high schools and talked to their peers about the importance of registering to vote as soon as they turn 18 and voting and getting involved in civic engagement, getting involved in the process. And we've had a very good modicum of success with that in terms of increasing the turnout by the 18 and above age group. And we need to continue doing things like that.
Well, I want to thank you for being on this program and making us aware of what's happening to our democratic system and what we can do to make it better.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Professor. Thank you for having me back.
And thanks for watching another program, Perspectives El Paso.